Hello, and welcome to The Elements of Character, a brief introduction to the use of character in literature. So, to start off, we're going to begin with some basic terms. You may have learned some of these before. If so, great, this is a good review. But if not, we're going to go through kind of the fundamental things we need to understand about the idea of character before we can really do a close reading of any narrative, any story. So first, let's talk about what a character actually is. A character can be defined as an agent of action in the story, an agent of action. That means that they are typically human, of course, but not always in cases of science fiction or even in sometimes, you may have read Watership Down at some point or seen the movie. That's rabbits as characters, but they are the agents of action. An agent means they're the ones who are making things happen, and they are the one to whom things happen. That's what our characters are. So, of course, in most of the books you're reading, those are human characters. So it kind of goes without saying that they are characters, but thinking of it in that larger framework can help us understand character in other types of literature. Your main characters, your leading characters, I should say, are your protagonists. Those are characters whose actions, their thoughts, their experiences, they're the ones we're following. So if you think about it as like a camera lens is following them around, that's who your protagonist is. You can have more than one, but if you think of some kind of well-known ones, Luke Skywalker in Star Wars and Katniss Everdeen in The Hunger Games, these are people whose stories we are following. That makes them the protagonists. It doesn't always mean a hero in the traditional sense or conventional sense, and we'll talk more about hero later on in the semester, but it is our main character. And against them is the antagonist. That could be the character or characters who work against the protagonist. So they're the ones that are kind of keeping the protagonist from reaching their ultimate goal. Or they could represent the opposition that the protagonist must face. So if the protagonist is facing some issues that are maybe internal conflict, the antagonist can represent that even if they aren't, actively working against the protagonist. But they are the forces against which the protagonist has to work. So, of course, in those, like with Luke Skywalker and Katniss Everdeen, Darth Vader, President Snow, those are some of the antagonists, not the only ones in either of those stories, but those are kind of the ultimate antagonists. But again, remember that antagonists don't have to be bad guys. Certainly in detective literature, we see a lot of that because your antagonist is often, the person who is committing the murder. And so that's the bad guy. That's the one who's keeping the detective from solving it. But in other cases, an antagonist can just be someone who represents what the character is up against. Characters as a whole can be a few different things. They can be dynamic, which means they are capable of change or development over the course of the story. They do develop, they do grow. Characters who change over the course of the story are considered dynamic characters. They could also be static, which is kind of the flip to that. Static characters are unchanged from the beginning of the story to the end. Now, that could mean because they're only in part of it or they're underdeveloped. Whatever it may be, static characters are ones we don't witness their change in any noticeable way over the course of the story. They could be round, which is complex and realistic. It means that the author has developed them so much that they feel like real people. And the complexity there is important. It means that they maybe contradict themselves at some points. They might have some good traits and bad traits. We understand them more as fuller people. And then we also have flat characters. Those are undeveloped. Those are going to be ones that we know only for one or two traits. For instance, if a scene has a waitress walk in or a waiter walk in, they are maybe just walk across the stage, throw down the check, and then leave. They are a flat character. The only thing we know about them is that they're on a wait staff, right? That's not a developed character. That's not someone we know things about. So that would be considered a flat character. Every story is going to have some flat and static characters, and every story is going to hopefully have some dynamic and round characters. Those are the ones we relate to. Those are the ones we care about. A good writing will give us some characters to care about. And that's dynamic and or round characters are what we like there. But again, static and flat, that's something that happens. They exist. They have to, typically. So when we think about character, we also think about the idea of point of view. So we know that the term narrator, that's the person or voice that tells the story. They narrate. Remember that story is also, we could also say narrative, right? So the narrator is the one who tells the narrative. But that voice that is the narrator's can be a few different perspectives. So then we think about point of view, the lens through which we are told the story. And I do, again, kind of always go back to that idea of a camera lens. It is the camera lens through which we are seeing what unfolds. A camera lens at a different perspective. You know, a camera from above shows us something different from a camera that's following somebody from behind, which shows us something different from a camera that's close up on somebody's face or far away from somebody's face. So if we think of point of view as the way that writers can use that camera lens to tell us where and who, and to really build the story, to give us the story that we are watching. So one common form of point of view is first person. First person, you'll see that with I, me, my, our, us, we pronouns. When you see those, that's a sign that we're dealing in first person. That's when a character is the narrator. So somebody in the story is telling us the story. And that's the minute you see I, me, my, our, us, we, if we have a narrator who is using those words, not just in dialogue, but a narrator who is using those words, then we have a first person story. It trumps whatever else happens. If you see those first person pronouns, you have a first person story. One thing that's interesting about first person is that whenever, just by definition of having a first person narrator, we have what we call an unreliable narrator. Now, unreliable could be because the narrator is lying to us or leaving certain things out, but more often it's the case of because we are following just one person's perspective and they are telling us the story, then we are limited by what they know. We can only know what they know. We can only see what they see. We can only be where they are. And that means it's unreliable in that we're not going to be able to get the full picture of the story. So a first person detective story means we're following, one part of that story, that detective looking for that, the criminal or whoever it may be. So by definition, it's going to be unreliable. Remember that unreliable doesn't have to mean negative, doesn't have to mean liar, though it certainly can. There is such a thing as second person perspective. It is far less common in literature, in fiction rather, I should say. It certainly comes up a fair amount in poetry, but your second person pronouns would be you and your. Keep in mind, again, that if you see the first person pronouns listed above, if they're in the narrative, then it's a first person story, regardless of whether you also have a you or your. But if you only have you or your pronouns, then the narrator is kind of the voice of an onlooker. It's almost like somebody is narrating just what's happening, but they're speaking to it as if it was a you. You do this, you do that, you go here. Again, that's kind of a tricky point of view, and so it's not one we see a lot in fiction, but it is possible, and that's one thing to know. Finally, what we see probably the most often in fiction is third person. That's they, she, he, or it. In this case, the narrator is an invisible person other than the character, right? There's not a specific person telling us the story. It's more of just the camera lens telling us the story. But within that, there are different forms of third person. The first is objective. Objective third person is when we can see into no one's thoughts. So in this case, it is literally like a camera lens in that you are just watching what is happening, but you cannot know what any of the people are thinking. We're just looking at the action. Again, that's not all that common, but it can happen. That's objective. You see it objectively. There's no subjective viewpoint being put on it. You're just watching the actions. There's also limited, which is where you can see into one character's thoughts. That's quite common, where it's a third person story, but we're in the head of one person. We just aren't getting it through their eye perspective, right? That means we can know some things they don't know or have a perspective that's a bit separated from their thoughts. It's typically seen as a much more reliable narrator. Multiple and limited can sometimes be used to mean the same thing as multiple, where we get into a few characters' thoughts, right? With limited, strictly speaking, we're just in one character's thoughts. With multiple, we go in a few different characters' thoughts, but not everybody. One or two, maybe three, a limited number. But you can kind of go back and forth between different characters. Typically, these shifts would happen by chapter, right? You might have one chapter in one character's point of view, and then you shift to another chapter for another character's point of view. And finally, we have omniscient. Omniscient. That is godlike. That means the narrator can see all the characters' thoughts. Everybody is fair game. They can comment on what happens. They can know information that the characters do not, because they are above and have a bigger view. And that's where they can know everything. They know the future, they know the past, and sometimes you'll get some personality from a narrator. They might be kind of somewhat making fun of the characters or playing with them in some way or sad for them in some way. That would be a strictly omniscient viewpoint, is where you can see everything and know everything. So these different perspectives not only are just traits of a story, that a story might be a first person story or a second person story. But as you can see here, it also changes what kinds of information we get and how we access the story. So it's important to think with point of view about how that choice, the author's choice of point of view, tells us something about the story and changes our experience as readers. If we are in a first person point of view, for instance, we know we might get unreliable information. We know we're only going to have one person's point of view, at least in that part. And so that should make us think, what are we missing? What else is in the story that maybe this person isn't telling us or can't tell us? And then with our third persons, those different choices can mean different things about what we can access and what we can't. So in addition to approaching the story with a specific point of view, we also have a few different means and methods that writers use to develop characters. There are a few different ones here that writers use to develop and convey their characters. The first one is physical description and appearance. That can be things that they are wearing, things about how their face looks, their skin color, their hair, their age and wrinkles, that kind of thing. Physical description and appearance can tell us something about character. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's just a description, right? But other times it can tell us about who we're dealing with. So if you think about Hercule Poirot's mustache and his egg-shaped head, that tells us that he's kind of an odd person. He has a certain look about him, and his mustache, this very specific kind of grooming habit that tells us something about him. We can also learn about and develop characters through actions and behavior. When we see what a character does, that tells us something about them. For example, Flora Ackroyd, upon learning that her uncle was dead, she fainted. Well, that tells us something about who Flora is. That's a different reaction than if she had, say, laughed or jumped up and down or squealed. Those would be obviously a very different person would have done those things. So the action tells us something about the character. Speech, certainly the lines that people say tell us about their character. With The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, I think about Mrs. Ackroyd's overly dramatic speech. She is like, this example I gave you, I'm prostrated, absolutely prostrated, right? She's always very dramatic, very focused on herself. It takes 27 words to say what she could say in one. It's kind of an overblown speech. That tells us something about who she is. She speaks differently than other characters do. You get internal thoughts. And this, with The Murder of Roger Ackroyd is very much Dr. Shepard, the way he thinks, and sometimes those thoughts being different from what he says or does. If you think about as he's having conversations with his sister Caroline, he has thoughts about her, even though he doesn't always say them out loud. Those internal thoughts tell us a lot about who he is. And finally, other characters' reactions to them. The way that people react not only tell us something about the person having the reaction, but it also tells us something about the person they are reacting to. So, when people are meeting Poirot and they treat him like he's a strange little man, that tells us that he's he's kind of different from everybody else. He's one of the other. He's a foreigner. He's not like the people around there. They're suspicious of him. They think he's strange. Their reactions to him tell us about them, and they tell us about him. So when we know that writers are using these types of cues to reveal character, we can look at a text and learn about the character, the time, the place, all of that. We can learn about it by looking closely at these elements. So to give you an example, I pulled a passage from in my book, it's page 19 and 20. This is when Poirot and Dr. Shepherd first meet. And there's a lot in here. I'm just going to show you one example of each. But just in this page-long passage, we can see a few things at work that are revealing character. So first we see action. Right before this passage, Poirot had thrown the vegetable marrow over the fence and it landed on Dr. Shepherd. So the action of throwing that tells us something, but also Dr. Shepherd's looking up angrily, and then he sees this man. That interaction tells us something about character. We also get physical description. Again, we mentioned the egg-shaped head, the two immense mustaches, the watchful eyes, the ways though are not just what we're told about him, but the way it's described, the watchful eyes, the suspiciously black hair, those words, suspiciously watchful, that contributes to our understanding of who this character is. So it's not just what they include as far as physical description goes, but it's also how they include it, how a writer includes it, that tells us about a character. We get speech. Again, just a couple of examples. We see the first time we hear Poirot talking, it's, "I demand of you 1,000 pardons, monsieur. I send them to promenade themselves. Alas, not only mentally, but physically." We know something about the formality of this person. We know also, I don't think promenade is probably exactly the word he meant there. He meant show themselves. I want them to show themselves. He says promenade, which is like a parading verb. And so that also tells us something about this being a non-native English speaker. That gives us a clue to his character there. We get internal thoughts. I think sometimes it can be subtle to the point of not always being obvious, but, Dr. Shepherd has a little bit of humor in the way he thinks. He says, "I sincerely hoped that throwing large vegetables over walls was not our new friend's hobby. Such a habit could hardly endear him to us as a neighbor." He's making a joke there. It's saying, it's kind of hyperbole for the point of making a joke. And hyperbole is exaggeration in order to make a point. That tells us a little bit about Dr. Shepherd and how he kind of wryly looks at the world. We also get other characters' reactions. And so in this case, we're thinking because of how Shepherd reacts to Hercule Poirot, he says, "Clearly a retired hairdresser." Well, that tells us something about Dr. Shepherd, certainly. The way he jumps to conclusions about this person and also kind of writes him off. He sees him as unimportant and silly. But also it tells us something about Poirot. The way he presents tells us who he is and what he looks like and, who he is as a character, which again is somebody of the other, somebody that is different from the people around him. So these are just a few examples of times we can see these tools at work in a text. So if we look closely at the text and look at the way things are said and what is said, then we can draw larger conclusions about who they are as characters. That's how we close read for character. So as you read both this text and any others that we read this semester or that you read beyond this semester, I want you to think about where and how you can spot the writer building character. Because when we can see those tools in action, and when we think about point of view, and we think about how the protagonist and antagonist are developed, those factors help us understand the story the writer is trying to tell. That's how we closely read for character.